see how he can do anything other than veto their accession. Of course, if that does happen, then the Finns and the Swedes will have still given away their neutrality, because, to be very clear, an application to join NATO is a repudiation of neutrality. They will have thrown away their neutrality without getting the alleged benefits of the NATO protection that comes with Article 5. So it will be a disaster, a catastrophe for those countries.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, it's something that people don't seem to realize. They look at Sweden, they look at Finland, and they're these socialist, postmodern socialist utopias. Everything is so wonderful and beautiful and pretty and clean, and healthcare and retirement and all that. Well, how do you think that they paid for that? They paid for that because they didn't need to have a huge army or a large defense expenditures. They could divert what would have been their defense expenditures into the public sector, into social programs, because their neutrality allowed them to. From the point of view of the Soviet Union and Russia, having neutral Finland and neutral Sweden, neither country is of any interest historically to the Soviet Union and now Russia. And so they would never really going to bother with either country. And that's why those two countries could afford to have the wonderful social systems that they had. Now they're not going to be able to afford them, because by merely applying to NATO, as you very well put it, they're foregoing their neutrality. Ergo, they're going to have to spend a lot of money on defense, because all of a sudden it's an issue. For the Russians, paradoxically, having Finland and Sweden become a part of NATO simplifies the situation militarily for them.
Yeah.
Because now they're going to have, do keep in mind, the Russians do have a border with NATO countries, so the Baltic republics. But you see, the Baltic republics are geographically isolated. And so in many ways, they are a pushover. The same with Finland, the same with Sweden to a lesser extent. That militarily they're a pushover. Having them neutral created problems for them. But the end of that neutrality makes it simpler for the Russians. They can easily sweep into the Baltic republics, militarily sweep into the Baltic republics and Finland, and have control of that. And all of a sudden, it's a totally different Baltic Sea. And people don't seem to realize this. Of course, the military planners, I mean, quite apart from the political planners, I mean, Jens Stoltenberg. I'm sorry, but I have to say this. Jens Stoltenberg is the dumbest white man to ever walk the earth, because he is so stupid. He is on the level of Kamala Harris. That's how stupid. Those two together should be together, because together they're stronger, aren't they? But anyway, I'm referencing the idiotic speech that Kamala Harris gave. But just to finish this point about Finland and Sweden, they are destroying themselves. They are a part of this insane cabal. And the worst part is that it's ideological and moral virtue signaling. And the final point, the Europeans are committing financial suicide in a way that is very, very reminiscent of 1914, where the Europeans committed demographic suicide by throwing their troops into a war that was pointless and needless. They are throwing their economies into a pointless and needless war that they cannot win. And that's tragedy. If you think of what they are doing now as analogous to 1914, only instead of people, it's economies, they are acting exactly the same way.
Yeah, a number of points here, Gonzalo, which is basically taking it further from where you are, because I know these countries. I never been to Sweden, but I've been to Finland. I know Finland reasonably well. I've been to Helsinki, marvelous city, by the way, very, very like St. Petersburg in places, because it was built by the Russians at the time when Finland was part of the Russian Empire. And I also know Germany. The whole point about the German, Scandinavian, North European social democracies, and of course the Scandinavians, including the Finns, took that incredibly well, is of course they were underpinned by very, very productive, highly productive industries, which, by the way, were heavily protected industries, which provided the tax revenues upon which you could build up the welfare models. Now, those industries in terms of Germany and to some extent Scandinavia depended, as you correctly said, on relatively low defense spending, but also, of course, on cheap, reliable, steady energy.
Yeah.
Increasingly coming from Russia. Take that all away, you can't maintain those industries.
No.
You don't have the tax revenue to sustain your welfare systems. Those welfare systems are, of course, already buckling because of immigration pressures, which they were not designed to cope with. And it's very, very difficult to see what's left of German and Scandinavian social democracy surviving. Now, earlier generations of social democrats in Scandinavia knew this very well. So if you're talking about Swedish leaders like Tage Erlander, who was the Swedish prime minister, social democratic prime minister in the 1960s, or Urho Kekkonen, who was the president of Finland. He wasn't a social democrat. He was from the Agrarian Party, but he pursued social democrat policies, and he was allied much of the time with the Social Democrats. They understood that very well. Now, that earlier tradition of social democrats, which is the political tradition I used to identify with, I go back far. I first became involved in politics in the late 1970s. It seems an incredibly long time ago now. But that earlier generation of social democrat leaders would never have allowed their countries, Finland and Sweden, to make this utterly disastrous decision that we now see. Kekkonen and Erlander must be spinning in their graves with anger, because everything that they believed in and had built up has been destroyed by parties that they used to be allied with, or in the case of Erlander, they used to lead. So that's what's happening to North European social democracy. It is being destroyed. And of course, notice that the people who are destroying it are all of them utterly committed supporters of the EU, which is now essentially the litmus test in much of this part of Europe as to whether you're left or right. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is about the euro. Consider the paradox. The sanctions on the Russian central bank were intended to cause the ruble to crash. What is actually done is it's because it's forced the Russians, well, not forced the Russians, because it's caused the Russians to insist on gas for rubles. It's causing the euro to depreciate. It's strengthened the ruble and it's weakened the euro. Now, for the Europeans, this is a serious problem, because though we trade with each other in Europe in euros, we import much of our energy and much of our food from abroad. And we pay for those things principally in dollars, or in terms of our gas, now in rubles. So we're just stoking up inflation within the Eurozone economies.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that, see, what the sanctions did essentially was that it eliminated Russian demand for European goods and services.
Yeah.
Now, you have to remember, you both, Alex and Alexander, will know this, but this is for the chat for those people who might not understand how it works. But you see, when people in Russia say they want to buy a BMW car, they need to pay for that car in euros. And so they have to go out into the open market with their rubles, because that's what the people in Russia earn. They earn rubles. And they take those rubles and they go typically to their central bank by way of their commercial bank. And they will buy euros from the central bank. The central bank will give them the euros. That person takes those euros and goes to the BMW in Germany and plops down those euros and says, give me a car, right? I'm of course simplifying just for the sake of understanding the situation. Now, when you eliminate Russian demand for European goods and services, see, what happens is that there is not only less demand for the goods and services of Europe, there is less demand for the currency of Europe. See, and you'd think, well, it's not that big of a deal, yeah. But the thing is, see, all of economy is just marginal. It's just a little bit, a couple of percentage points here and a couple of percentage points there is the difference between an economy that's growing and an economy that's depressed and going down the tubes. An economy is surprisingly delicate when it is going at high revs, as the global economy has been going over the last 40, 50 years. 40 years after the end of the oil shock of 79, when the economies came out of the 82 recession. It's been basically 40 years. And the economies of the West, including Russia, have been revving up. And this whole contraction of the economy, German industry is selling less, and at the same time, there is less demand for euros. And so what's going to happen in Europe is that we're not going to have a recession. We are going to have an open depression because there isn't going to be the demand for European goods, and the currency is collapsing. We're seeing it. I'm watching it every day. I actually have positions in euro that I'm trying to get out of desperately because of this goddamn situation. Okay, it is collapsing. The eurozone is going down the tubes, and what is going to happen, of course, is that the various economies within Europe are going to start to say, I don't want to drown with these other people, because some of those economies would actually be better off without the euro. Some of these economies would be better off if they had their own local currency that they could devalue and have some competitiveness in this new economy. A lot of them are probably looking at Hungary. That Hungary is part of the part of the European Union, but has its own currency. And its independent currency allows it to be a lot more flexible in these changing situations, this changing environment. And so you see the problem that's going on in Europe. You're having a fall in demand and also a fall in demand for the currency, i.e. inflation. And so it's going to be beyond stagflation. Everybody's saying, oh, it's going to be like the doldrums of the 70s. No, it's going to be like not even the 1930s depression. I would argue that it's going to be much more like the global depression of the 1890s, where the currency was losing value drastically, even as the economy was collapsing and contracting. So I think that that's what we should be looking at, something closer to the 1890s.
Yeah, which is a recession, a depression, of course, that isn't much discussed because for some reason it's never registered that it was actually a gruelingly tough recession. It lasted for about a decade, and it was actually very, very debilitating in European society. I was going to make a suggestion. We've been talking for about an hour. We suggested that we would do 2 hours. Shall we start addressing some questions? What do you guys think?
Absolutely.
What do you think, Alex?
Yeah,
we do an hour of questions.
Got a few questions. Let's answer some questions. Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. Let's start with Life of Brian, who says, "What the world needs now is Clown World intro theme music." Agree with you, Life of Brian.
Agree.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's see here.
I would suggest it be the Benny Hill music. Remember the Benny Hill music?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I used to love Benny Hill.
Yeah, that's the song for these times, I think.
Yeah. Let's see. Novus Black says, "Is the ruble going stronger, or is the dollar losing value, and is the ruble just staying the same?"
Both.
Both. Well, first of all, the dollar is increasing. It's strengthening against most currencies, except against the ruble, against which it is depreciating. But of course, the dollar remains strong in other respects. It is the euro that is under the real pressure at the moment.
Yeah, the dollar is strengthening because people are exiting euro positions.
Exactly.
Because the euro has always been considered, to a great extent, essentially pegged to the dollar. Exactly. But since the European economy is going down the tubes, then everybody's saying, better to exit our euro positions. And that's why you're having sell-offs in euro bonds and euro-denominated assets
Yeah.
And that's why you're seeing the daily loss of value of the euro vis-a-vis the dollar, and the dollar strengthening. But it's one has to emphasize that the dollar strength is not organic. It's
No.
people fleeing to safety, to relative safety in
Exactly.
these times. If people could, they would all pile into the ruble. I can tell you right now, half a dozen people that I'm in contact with wish that there was an easy way to get into the ruble, because everybody's realizing what's going on and how the ruble is essentially backed by $75 trillion worth of commodities that are buried in the ground in Russia. And so everybody's realizing that's the currency I want to get into.
Yeah.
Kaliningrad. We had the question about
Oh yeah,
Kaliningrad.
Kaliningrad.
Any update
Right,
there about Kaliningrad? There was some talk
Yeah.
between the Polish, I think the Polish foreign minister and the mayor of Kaliningrad, where they talked about changing Kaliningrad's name or something like that.
Yes, I know there was some talk about this, but the main thing is that Poland and the Baltic states are trying to cut off Kaliningrad from its road and rail links with Russia. So essentially, it has to be resupplied and connected by sea through the Baltic Sea. So there's pressure on Kaliningrad. I don't personally think this is dramatically dangerous, and I still think that any Western attempt to attack Kaliningrad would be utter folly. It is very, very heavily defended. There's lots of Russian troops there, and though officially there's no nuclear weapons there, I'm pretty sure that the Russians would see it as an attack on their national territory, and if it was done by NATO, it would very quickly escalate into some sort of war type scenario. And the other thing I would say is that I understand that, as is always the case, the people in these places feeling themselves under pressure are particularly patriotic and, loyal to Russia.
Yeah. Sparky says yakety sax is the Benny Hill music. Yakety sax. I did not know that. Thank you, Sparky, for that.
An unperson here in Britain, by the way. I haven't heard anybody mention him. I mean, he used to be a person who with enormous influence in Britain. Everybody knew who he was, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. But it's a long, long time since I've heard his name.
Benny Hills?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
He's been canceled, is what you're saying, Alexander?
Pretty much. Does it surprise
harmless man.
Does it surprise you? At least that's my own view. Anyway, shall we move on?
Red
too white and too sexist. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Red Viking says, what kind of plastic NAZIs surrender? Well said, Red Viking. Possum Power says the one condition was no filming. Just saying. With the evacuation, there was no filming allowed.
That is difficult to accept because I'm actually seeing films and I'm seeing lots of photographs now appearing. In fact, there's one film I've seen in which there's this whole line. You can see it's an aerial shot, obviously taken by a drone. A whole line of Ukrainians moving across the Azovstal place, often carrying stretchers. So there is film, and of course photographs. I've seen some pretty vivid photographs in which people are being you see the Russians carrying out the usual searches and things of that kind. So I'm not convinced that even that restriction, that those terms have really existed to any great extent.
All right. Balki says, absolutely, they will be photographed, shaven and photographed again, databased and correlated to each and every war crime that is registered.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The Russians are very serious about doing a full-on Nuremberg type trial. And I think that it is, they don't want it to be perceived by anybody as a show trial. They want to make it as clear and above board and squeaky clean and formally proper as possible. And I don't blame them, quite frankly, because these guys are pigs as far as I'm concerned.
No.
Sparky
By the way, can I just quickly say, I mean, we haven't yet heard that all of the people in Azovstal have given up. I wonder whether there'll be some holdouts. If there's people who are afraid of those kind of things, trials and all the rest, it's not impossible that some of them might just try to cling on. Just saying. We'll see.
Oh yeah, I agree. I agree. Also,
Yeah.
I think that some of the foreigners, whomsoever they may be,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that they also are going to
Yeah.
try to cling on or something. There's been talk about some American general
Yeah.
that was fished out, but I have not heard confirmation.
No,
And so,
I don't believe that story. I mean, and in fact, in terms of that particular American general, the photograph that was circulating was actually that of a well-known Ukrainian Azov person. So there was some muddle. So let's. I'm not going to fall. I'm not going to start talking about that until I actually see some proof. There's
yeah,
lots
exactly.
of wild rumors, and at the moment, as far as I'm concerned, there are only rumors.
Yeah.
Sparky says, good work, fellas. John says, yes, good day, John. Zach Boyle says, it's a pattern of ex-pandemic vaccine, now evacuation. Well said, Zach. Andy Warhawk says, if NATO were to attack Russia directly, which border would this attack take place from?
That's a very good question. And so, I mean, I'm not a military person. I'm not going to even try and guess. What I will say is this: both the Russian and American militaries seem increasingly to be thinking that the Arctic is going to be the real point of battle. I mean, the Russians have been engaging in a massive reorganization of their forces in the Arctic, building bases, developing air defense systems, those sort of things. And if you look at the way in which their fleet is increasingly configured, it's basically increasingly becoming a fleet to wage war in the Arctic. And I suspect the US will probably want to do the same. And coming back to what Gonzalo was saying about Finland and Sweden joining NATO, simplifying Russian defense planning. If you think of the Arctic as the point of conflict, that makes complete sense, that it would be much easier to gain control of Scandinavia quickly as part of this, huge war that, might happen in the Arctic. But, all of this, I stress again, I'm not a military person. So, it's just, what I've heard people say.
I have to say about what would be the weakest point for NATO to attack? That's a very good question, but I have come to the conclusion, and I mentioned this I said this in a video that I did yesterday. I think that in a very real sense, I cannot point to anything specific. This is just an abductive inference based from a lot of different little data points. But it seems to me that the NATO commanders have realized that they can't really win with Russia, because ultimately Russia is a land power. And the United States, which is the real NATO, if we're talking about it, the United States is a naval power. It has 11 carrier battle groups. The Russians have one carrier, and certainly not the kind of battle group that the United States has. The United States is a naval power. That's how it wins wars. And I think that because of this, there is the realization that, no, we could really handle China, because China seems to be the coming thing. With these confrontations over the Solomon Islands, which is just ridiculous, because on its face, the agreement between China and the Solomon Islands is trivial. It's certainly not a military base or anything like that, but it's being blown out of proportion to create the excuse for the Americans to get into a war. And I personally think that NATO, at some point in the last three to 5 weeks, collectively made the decision, the United States, the military establishment collectively made the decision that war with Russia is a mistake, but war with China is winnable. And that's the feeling I get. I stress this is not something I can point to specifically, but there's that vibe. And also the obvious fact, we are now 10 weeks more? We're 12 weeks into this war. And not one NATO boot has been on the ground, at least not officially. And so I don't think it's going to happen. The entirety of the Western Ukraine has been wide open, really. But NATO has not come in. Poland, for all of its posturing, is not coming in. So, this, of course, could change. There are rumors, of course, that, come the 22nd or the 21st of 22nd or the 24th of May, there's going to be some movement. Well, we'll see if that happens. But those wild predictions sometimes are just wild predictions. But China is the real thing. Because ultimately, even the neocons acknowledge that Russia is just to weaken China. Russia, in and of itself, is not important to them. They want to weaken and do a regime change in China, of all things. So, yeah, that's the thing. That's what I'm thinking.
Just to say, Gonzalo, I remember this was during the Cold War. I remember somebody once telling me, a military person, British military person, that a conflict between the US and Russia would be a battle between the elephant and the whale.
Yeah.
They don't really have many points of overlap.
All right, Tina, thank you for that super sticker. Anoop, thank you for that super sticker. Leon says, will we see an evacuation from the Battle of the Donbass soon? Evacuation, in quotes.
One would like to think so in some ways. I mean, in the sense that what's happening in Donbass is utterly grim. I mean, Alex, Gonzalo, and I, we go through all sorts of places. We see pictures and films of what's going on there, and it is beyond harrowing. And it is overwhelmingly Ukrainians that we see. I look for pictures of Russians, but I don't find them, and that's, I think, an important point to make. And I look for pictures of Russian prisoners, and I don't find them either. But which is not to say that the Russians don't experience defeats from time to time. They did when they tried to cross that river, and we saw the pictures of the pontoon bridge, which was destroyed, and the Russian vehicles all around, not all of which were destroyed, though, by the way. But overall, it is exactly what Gonzalo was saying. It is awful, and 400 to 700 Ukrainian soldiers are dying there every day. So to hold on to territory which doesn't want to be part of Ukraine, so logically pull them back. People talking about bleeding Russia white. The country that's being bled white is Ukraine, not Russia. And as I want to just repeat again, long wars, if they end in victory, strengthen countries, they don't weaken them. And if you want the classic example of this, look to the United States, which fought that terrible war in the 1860s, the war, the war between the states, the Civil War, whatever you want to call it. The US eventually, the North won, and despite of all that expenditure of men and lives and weapons and all the rest, it came out of it much more powerful. So this idea that you can weaken Russia by prolonging this war, the country you're weakening and destroying is Ukraine.
I completely agree. I completely agree.
WOTB, thank you for that super chat. Command unit says more Ukrainian soldiers need to evacuate to Russia.
Yeah.
Jeffrey Rock says, I've heard it said that the U.S. can't handle a two-front war. If they can't get rid of Putin, perhaps the backup is to bleed Russia dry so Europe won't feel threatened while Uncle Sam looks east over Taiwan.
Well, I think I've just answered that question. I think on the contrary, and I want to just say this, if you start a war in the Pacific at the same time as you've got an ongoing conflict in Europe, you're not making Europe safer. You're making it more vulnerable, because then you are getting yourself into a two-front war.
Yeah, and look, again, the Americans, they realize that their economic might is coming to an end. They fundamentally realize this. And so the idea of overstretching themselves on a two-front war, even they are not that crazy. And so I think that if push comes to shove, or when push comes to shove, they'll focus on China, because they view China as more of a threat. Because even though Russia is showing itself to be awesome, militarily speaking, because this really is awe-inspiring, the way that they have handled this conflict and the way that they really have dominance over it. Whatever happens on a tactical level, on a day-to-day level, little counter-offensives going one way or the other, and the battle lines moving here and there. At the end of the day, we are 3 months into this conflict, and they are taking a huge bite out of Ukraine, and they are completely, quote-unquote, demilitarizing Ukraine. In 90 days, this is incredible. I mean, you have to stand back and say, my God, yeah? And so the Americans fundamentally recognize this, but at the same time, they have this bizarre notion that Russia is just a gas station with nukes. And so they don't take it quite seriously and as such an existential threat as they do China. And so that's why I think that when push comes to shove, and it will, that day will come, they'll put all of their attention on China and defeating China in the Pacific. In a weird way, the people who are in leadership positions today will want to repeat the Great Pacific Victory of World War II. And that arrogance, that hubris will be their downfall. That's my thinking.
Well, can I also say, I'm afraid you may be right. And what a tragedy, because I don't think the United States has anything to fear from peaceful competition with China. I mean, I really don't. I mean, I've been to China, very impressive in many ways, huge manufacturing economy. But anybody who has been there would also have noticed, that there's lots of things that are not working perfectly well, and that the United States retains enormous strengths. So making this into a geopolitical struggle for mastery is stupid. It's not playing to America's strengths. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, and because look, the whole thing of maintaining unipolarity, of maintaining overwhelming dominance, it's a recipe for world war. And most important of all, this is basically the Wolfowitz doctrine. And the worst part of it all is that, see, you can't maintain that. And it's pointless to try to do that. And it is to your benefit to allow multipolarity and not try to fight the tide of history. I think that's the thing. See, the Americans twice in the last century were sort of like the great power alone among nations. Right after World War II and right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they crested twice, and it was just a momentary accident of history. And instead of saying, "Oh, we're the sole superpower right now, but this is just luck and it'll change because." History reverts to the mean, like everything. Instead, they decided, no, we are going to maintain this superior status to everyone. And we are going to dominate everyone and potentially invade everywhere or anywhere in order to maintain this dominant position. This is hubris, insanity, and this is what it's led us to.
From Bauke, can we synchronize our information? How many are still left in the plant, do we think?
There's been some interesting things. Now, this is from a pro-Russian website. Now, I really want to make this clear. This is a pro-Russian website, but it says in total there were over 2,500 people were there at the time the commissioning began. I'm not quite sure what the commissioning means.
I think it means decommissioning.
Sorry?
I think they meant decommissioning. Decommissioning as a euphemism for total annihilation.
Yes. Oh, these Azov are 804. 404 wounded, of which 55 are severe, 200 dead. And there was also 3 Russian prisoners held in the factory. 1 officer and 2 soldiers. So 2,500 men. We don't yet know how many of them have come out and surrendered. But I want to stress, that's a Russian website. It's a pretty accurate one, mainly run by a man called Boris Rogin, whom I'm sure both Gonzalo and Alex have come across. But I can't vouch for the accuracy of those figures, but that gives us an overall sense of what was the numbers apparently in the factory. And I would also say that so far it's about 300 people that we know have come out and handed themselves in. We don't know whether there've been more over the course of the day, though I suspect there have.
From Steve-O, I heard a rumor that Russia warned Erdogan about the coup against him a few years ago. Can Turkey's no to Sweden and Finland be a repayment to Russia?
Yeah, I know that story well.
I know that story well. I think there's
Yeah.
some credibility to it, by the way. I think that there are
Yeah.
reasons to think it may be true. But I don't think Erdogan thinks that, because the Russians helped me in 2016, I get to help them now. I don't think that's how well Erdogan behaves, actually. This is my own view. I'm going to hear what Gonzalo says. But I think this is just Erdogan starting, a haggle, and at the same time, setting himself up to the Turkish people at a time of deep economic crisis in Turkey as the man who defends Turkey and its interests.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Erdogan views this completely opportunistically.
Yeah.
I don't think he really cares about Finland and Sweden, like generally. If the two countries sort of like vanished, I don't think Erdogan would miss a wink.
Yeah.
I think that he's just looking at like, ooh, I can get something out of NATO, by throwing up a roadblock, and they'll have to pay me off somehow.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a shrewd man. I mean, there's a reason that he is where he is and has lasted as long as he has. So yeah, it's a shrewd bet, completely opportunistic, means nothing, and in the end, he will agree to Sweden and Finland joining. He'll just,
I agree.
get his pound of flesh in order to give his approval.
I agree.
Peter says, always great to hear Gonzalo. Keep up the great shows, the best media today. Thank you, Peter. Commando Crossfire says, congrats on the 100K subscribers, Alex. Silence becomes cowardice when occasion demands speaking out the whole truth and acting accordingly.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Yes, Alex, chat, please give a plus 11111 to Alex C for hitting the 100,000 mark. Yeah, we forgot to celebrate. I sent him a congratulatory email when it happened, but that was a private thing, and everybody in chat. Yes, Alex C is part of the six-figure club. Yeah, he's a big boy now.
The six-figure club.
Yeah, exactly. And now, just remember us, when you're rich and famous and powerful on YouTube, yeah. Congratulations, Alex.
Absolutely. And of course, I add mine, and Alex and I have been exchanging words about this. Can I just quickly say, against massive obstacles, which we're not going to discuss because, well, there's reasons why we can't, but it's a huge achievement. I know how hard.
My channel has gotten a lot of dings from from YouTube, that's for sure.
Yeah, the more truth you say, the more dings you get. That's how it works.
We'll keep on going on, though. We'll keep on going forward. Michael says, hello, Galimera. Galimera, Michael. Thank you for that super chat. Jam says, how will this war be seen and studied in the future?
That's a huge question, actually. I think the military people.
I think Gonzalo kind of answered.
Absolutely. I think the military people. Exactly. I think the military people will be fascinated by it, and I think lots of important military lessons have been learned. I mean, to give one example, a few months ago, it's only a few months ago, we were hearing about the all-invincible, all-conquering drone. Well, clearly that's not that important. So as I said, people will look at that. They'll look at the strategies, they'll look at the tactics, but of course it's a massively important geopolitical event, and the historians will be writing about it lots. Gonzalo?
Yeah, from my perspective, the things that are shocking is how fast it's happened. And that's something that I anticipated before this war, when I had been in other discussions about potential wars in the future with China and that sort of thing. And it was more really broad strokes and theoretically thinking, with the satellite and communications technology and all the rest of it, I was